Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football Deal. Sunday afternoon, Brian Kelly. The LSU Tigers are simply not slowing down in the transfer portal, landing the commitment of former Mississippi State quarterback Michael Van Buren. And Dill, when I saw this come about my timeline, I was almost mad at myself that I didn't think about this before it happened. This to me makes total sense. Like LSU was looking for a quarterback that they can kind of build and mold for the future. Mike Van Buren makes a ton of sense from LSU from a roster building standpoint. You look at what LSU's done in the portal. Not only are they getting very active and aggressive early, they're filling their additions up with like my guys, so to speak. You know, Barry Brown was my favorite wide receiver in the portal. He's heading to LSU. I was a fan of Bauer Sharp. I'm a big fan of Jamari Butler. And, you know, that's a commitment that's not going to get a lot of national media headlines. We're going to talk about him a little bit later. Big fan of that addition. And then Mike Van Buren, this was a guy that as a true freshman was thrown into the absolute wolves den starting at Mississippi State. I mean, that offensive line was the worst in the SEC. They couldn't run the football. They couldn't pass protect. They had a few weapons on the outside, and that was about the only thing that Mississippi State had going for them. Mike Van Buren, the numbers are not going to pop out on the page. The wins certainly aren't either. But when you turn this kid on as a true freshman in the SEC, was incredibly impressive. I think this is a fascinating get that makes a ton of sense. I'm excited to get into him. Before we do, and as always, to the LSU fans, it's been a blast talking this team the last 48 hours. Y'all have shown a ton of support to the boys. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Let it fly in the comment section. I would love to hear how the LSU fans are thinking about this one. And Dill, I kind of made it clear I'm a pretty big fan of this one. I think you're even a bigger fan of Mike Van Buren. How are we feeling about him heading down to LSU?
And you said it. I mean, absolutely came into a nightmare situation.
Yeah.
That Mississippi State team, before he kind of got rolling with them, I mean, they just weren't competitive in the football games they were supposed to be competitive in. And again, they didn't win a ton of games with him under the helm. But you look at some of like the Texas A&M, Georgia games, like he kind of kept them in those games, and they were fighting in them. And that to me is what almost like again, some of the talent you certainly saw. The accuracy is probably the big one that you saw when he was given a chance and some time, also getting the ball out of his hands quickly.
That's
But just like the competitive makeup of him, I think you can kind of tell when freshmen have it or they don't. And again, was everything perfect from like a technical standpoint? Probably not this year, but you definitely have a guy who I think has like that winner in him and that dog in him that you can at least work with going forward. Because there's certain guys who I just don't think have it.
it starts with the gamer that Mike Van Buren is. And you said it best. I mean, you start looking at the numbers. They averaged 3.8 yards per carry. That was outside of the top 90. The quarterback was getting sacked 9.5% of the time. That was 118th in the country. They gave up 122 quarterback pressures. Michael Van Buren was only kept clean on 60% of his dropbacks. I mean, he faced a crazy amount of pressure behind a horrible Mississippi State offensive line. You said one thing before we went live that I think is probably my biggest selling point on Mike Van Buren. He elevates those around him. He got some guys paid on the outside, like Kevin Coleman going to Missouri, Mario Cravers now getting asked for by pretty much every SEC program in the country. I mean, that largely because Michael Van Buren came in and was distributing the football at a high level. This is a guy that against Georgia threw for over 300 yards. You had Kirby Smart. I don't think he was embarrassed, but he kind of was embarrassed in the post-game press conference saying, yeah, we just had a true freshman quarterback just carve us up on defense. Those are good signs if you're Mike Van Buren, and it starts with elevating those around him. He is a gamer. Like that you can tell he's
You
tough as
said it, like the composure. Like again, even though like he was in constant chaos with that offensive line, again, the ball was getting out. They were still
yeah.
able to operate their offense for the most part in what Jeff Elby wanted to do with him at the helm. And that's no easy feat when again things are breaking down around you pretty consistently.
This kid's about as battle tested as it gets. He gets thrown in as a starter as a true freshman at Mississippi State. Even going back to his days at St. Francis Academy, like they would just play every single elite team across the country. Like they were flying out to St. John Bosco. They're going down to DeSoto, Texas. This kid has been, if there's a guy who's SEC ready, it's Michael Van Buren. And now in 2025, Dill, he finally gets that year to just learn and develop. And I think that year is going to be huge. And we all know what Joe Sloan can do with quarterbacks. And then you look at 2026, I think the big concern for LSU fans once you lost Bryce Underwood was, all right, what's the future look like at the quarterback position? You know, they were turning up the heat on a guy like Bryce Baker in the 2025 class. This to me makes a ton of sense. Like he might take a redshirt year and play in a few games in 2025. Then you get him in 2026 with what, 3 years of eligibility remaining? That's how you want it to look if you're LSU. Now, Dill, I think we got to talk about another addition that, again, I think kind of flew under the radar, and Jamari Butler. Numbers. I think it's a numbers game for LSU. They did not do enough last year in the transfer portal establishing depth on the defensive line. Is Jamari Butler going to come to Baton Rouge and be All-American, first-team All-SEC guy? No, probably not. Is he going to be very strong in the run game and then give you some pass rush production as well? Absolutely. This is not flashy, but we knew LSU wanted to build some depth in it, probably build a little bit of toughness out there on the edge as well. You know, outside of a guy like Braden Swinson, I felt like these LSU edge players were not good enough against the run. Guys like Deshaun Womack. Jamari Butler, he doesn't have the juice. He doesn't have the physical traits of a guy like Deshaun Womack. But, man, Jamari Butler is a guy that is tough as nails, can stop the run. To me, I think this one is, again, makes a ton of sense if you're an LSU fan.
Gives him a little bit of positional versatility. Like, I
Yep,
thought Paris
agreed.
Shan's ability to kind of kick in and out and play a whole lot, especially as LSU kind of brings guys like Relaford and some of those other young defensive tackles like Ahmad Bro and McKinley Jet, like those guys around or along, if you will. I think his versatility does give you a little bit of a way to fill some of that depth in, because for the next couple of years, I imagine until LSU can kind of matriculate their classes, if you will,
Yep.
that'll probably be an important factor for them.
Yeah, Dominic McKinley's a guy that I think he'll be a dude. I think we knew Dominic McKinley would take a year. I think he'll be a guy for LSU going into 2025. Look, LSU had some things to address in the offseason. I mean, quite frankly, they had some things to address in the offseason last year and really did it. Now going into 2025, Brian Kelly's clearly not making that mistake again. And one of the things that I am kind of picking up here is LSU is competitive in the NIL market. You know, like last year, they weren't really willing to pay for a guy like Derek Carmen, a Samir Barrow, or Dominic Williams. You fast forward to what we've seen the last couple of days, I guarantee you, like there were a lot of people knocking on Barry and Brown's door, giving him phone calls. I think the same thing for Jamari Butler, and I think certainly the same thing for Michael Van Buren. Like if you were a team that didn't have a quarterback of the future, you were probably ringing up Michael Van Buren. LSU being able to get that one done, that shows me that LSU's they're not sparing expense at becoming a team that can compete at the highest level of this college football sport. I think that's probably my biggest takeaway. We'll close it out there. Massive fan of the Mike Van Buren edition. And it sounds like LSU is nowhere close to being done. A lot of commitments left to talk about. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later.